as the rule of law has bent and been broken by Trump and his movement, we've also seen the democratic system bend and get broken by Trump and his movement. Obviously, we did not have a peaceful transfer of power the last time he competed in and lost an election. There is no commitment at all, no expectation at all by anyone that he and his followers will allow for a peaceful transfer of power this next time, if he loses this next election as well. He's not even giving lip service to the idea that they will allow for a peaceful transfer of power. He won't even say it and not mean it. And even more importantly than that just coming out of his face, in his Republican Party, accepting that his followers will not abide the results of the next election. And neither will the Republican Party in all of its power, in all of its resources. Accepting that is now the price of admission to power in that party. In March of this year, the Republican National Committee hired 2 new lawyers to oversee the party's election year legal efforts. Now, just 2 months after that, of those 2 lawyers, one of them's been indicted for helping in the effort to keep him in power illegally after he lost the last election. And the second one of those 2 lawyers has just been pushed out of his job at the RNC, reportedly because he's not willing to do the same thing. Quote, Trump originally approved of the hiring, one source told CNN, but sources said Trump was then angered after his allies pointed to clips of the lawyer criticizing the false claims that the 2020 election was stolen. So 2 lawyers hired by the RNC to oversee legal efforts around the 2024 election. One of them herself now under indictment. The other one reportedly fired for casting doubt that the last election was stolen, for suggesting that the real election results were a real thing. Think about that for a second. The chief counsel of the National Republican Party just fired, reportedly, because he was insufficiently enthusiastic about falsifying election results, about working to throw out real election results and get Trump into power despite them. I know this feels like, like an incremental update on the day's news, but just step back from this for a second. If it is now the de facto position of the mainstream Republican Party that we are not going to use the real results of elections to decide who is in power, if in order to be in a position of authority in the Republican Party now, you must now pledge to reject election results, then tell me, how are we going to decide who is in power in this country? What's the other mechanism we're going to use if it's not real election results? Democracy is mortal. It can be killed. It doesn't go away by someone, one day proclaiming we are no longer here by a democracy. It goes away when there stops being an expectation that we are governed by democratic means, when there stops being an expectation that elections are how we decide who's in power. Right? The way you lose your democracy is by losing the expectation that we are participating in an election because all sides in that election plan to accept the result, right? To go home if they lose and to go into office if they win. Once we no longer expect that, we are no longer in a democratic system of government in many important respects. Once one of the 2 major governing parties no longer believes elections are binding, then in many important ways, the democracy ship has sailed because they are no longer competing on democratic grounds. Right? Once one of the 2 major parties is no longer pledging that they will abide by the election results, whether they win or lose, the democratic system of government is not threatened with harm. It is wounded already. Threats to a democracy are not a theoretical prospect that looms sometime in the future, just like threats to the rule of law. Threats to democracy are also here now. Poll workers and election workers have been chased out of those jobs by the thousands, by violence and harassment and threats that are already here and that have already done their work. Who is going to stand up and say, okay, well, I'm capable, I'm brave, I'm willing to do something hard for my country this year, and I can take one of those jobs, I can take one of those seats, I can drive people to the polls and door knock for a campaign that I wasn't planning on working for. I will work at a polling place, right? Who's going to stand up and do that? Because thousands of experienced poll workers have been chased from their jobs because an anti-democratic movement in this country, led by the former president, has produced such an environment of threat and harassment and violence around those very low-level jobs in the technical part of our democracy that those jobs are unfilled. Who will fill those jobs? Who will do that work? It's not an esoteric thing. It is a practical thing. And the time is now. It's here. And I think the other part of it is recognizing that there is a reason that this is all happening. And this, to me, is the opposite of enervating. To me, this is energizing, understanding why it's happening, understand the sort of larger plot this is part of. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Anne Applebaum is here with us tonight. We're going to be speaking with her in just a few moments. She's just written this in The Atlantic, which I think is really important. The title is "Democracy is Losing the Propaganda War." Autocrats in China, Russia, and other places around the world are now colluding with MAGA Republicans to discredit liberalism and freedom everywhere. Applebaum writes that autocratic regimes have slowly turned their repressive mechanisms outward into the democratic world. If people are naturally drawn to the image of human rights, to the language of democracy, to the dream of freedom, then those concepts have to be poisoned. That requires more than a political system that defends against liberal ideas. It also requires an offensive plan, a narrative that damages the idea of democracy everywhere in the world, and the tools to deliver it. She says, quote, "Here is a difficult truth. A part of the American political spectrum is not merely a passive recipient of the combined authoritarian narratives that come from these authoritarian countries that are working to discredit democracy. But a part of the American political spectrum is an active participant in creating and spreading these narratives. Like the leaders of those authoritarian countries, the American MAGA right also wants Americans to believe that their democracy is degenerate, their elections illegitimate, their civilization dying. The MAGA movement's leaders also have an interest in pumping nihilism and cynicism into the brains of their fellow citizens and in convincing them that nothing they see is true. Their goals are so similar that it is hard to distinguish between the online American alt-right and its foreign amplifiers, who have multiplied since the days when this was solely a Russian project. One could call this a secret authoritarian plot to spread anti-democratic conspiracy theories. Except that it's not a secret. It's all visible right on the surface. Authoritarian regimes working with Americans to discredit democracy, to undermine the credibility of democratic leaders, to mock the rule of law. They do so with the goal of electing Trump, whose second presidency would damage the image of democracy around the world, as well as the stability of democracy in America even further. Speak with Anne Applebaum in just a moment. I'll just say there is a reason why the damage to the rule of law in our country, the damage to democracy in our country, which we have already started living with, there's a reason why it is coincident with a rise in authoritarianism around the world. And it's because we as a country are not immune to the same, pro-authoritarian, anti-democratic winds that blow through Europe and all over the rest of the world right now, too. Our democracy is mortal, too, just like every other democracy in history has ever been. Being real about the harm that has been done to us already, being clear-eyed about the fact that we can see some of these same dynamics at work in other countries, tuning into the fact that the right under Donald Trump is admiring of and openly emulating the way other countries have destroyed their democracies, recognizing they are willingly part of this project. That, to me, is energizing. I feel like that at least should put some steel in our spine, because it should tell us the part that we have to play here, right? It should at least give us real, grounded, practical expectations of where this is all going to go next and where our efforts are most needed to stand up for who we are. It should give us a clear sense of what we're going to need to defend and protect very soon, when the leader of our country's branch of this movement, sometime very soon, almost inevitably, is going to break that court order again and is now, we know today, going to be ordered into a jail cell. He inevitably, very soon, is going to be ordered into jail. Because we are on the precipice of that happening, and all the freak out that's going to attend it is something that we should expect. We need to be ready. We are on the precipice of that next step in what has already been a very difficult time for us as a country. So heads up, this is no time to check out.